Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Village Global's Venture Stories. I'm here today with a very special guest, Ali Tamaseb, investor at DCVC and author of Super Founders. Ali, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hey, Erik. I'm glad to be here.
So, Ali, thanks for coming on the podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself as an investor, and then introduce DCVC as well, and then we'll get to the book.
For sure. So I'm a partner at DCVC. We are a Silicon Valley fund. We invest in deep tech, so companies that are solving complex engineering or scientific problems, anywhere from space and building rockets to biomanufacturing and synthetic biology. We have over $2 billion under management and have invested in over 10 unicorns. Some of our companies recently went public, like Epsilera, Desktop Metal, Recursion Pharma, and we've invested in a number of other companies like Zymergen, Rocket Lab, Illumio, SentinelOne. I am a data-driven investor. I try to look at the data, and I spent the last 4 years writing this book, which has 40,000 data points. And a lot of my investments are data-driven as well, or metrics-driven. So some of the companies I've invested in are Carbon Health, which is a healthcare provider that has a tech-first urgent care and primary care service. Employs over 1,500 people. I am a unicorn now. I'm a board member. There's PlotLogic, an Australian company that works on mining and increasing the efficiency in mining of the rare earth metals. Investor in Starkware, which is in the blockchain scalability sector. Acceler in the blockchain interoperability sector. Pano in wildfire protection. And a number of other companies in different parts of deep tech. I'm interested in food, ag, new materials, construction, and things like that.
Ali, why don't you describe the main purpose of the book and what can people expect from reading it?
Sure. So it was about 4 years ago that I was thinking, what is it that actually differentiates billion-dollar companies from all these another 90-something% of companies that do not go anywhere or are smaller outcomes, and if there is anything that fundamentally differentiates between them. And a lot of people talk from gut feeling or single anecdotes or their personal experiences about what works and what doesn't work. And sometimes I hear these and I want to scream, say, okay, that's wrong. That the data is telling you that's wrong. So I started collecting this data, 65 data elements per company, per billion-dollar company, and then the same data on a randomly selected group of companies that did not become billion-dollar outcomes. They were smaller outcomes, or they were bankruptcies or failures. And this data encompasses everywhere from the founder's background, where they went to college, what they studied, where they worked, what was their career path, what companies they started before, to the idea itself, how the idea was generated, what the competition looked like, what type of pain it was going after, the defensibility factors, the competition, to fundraising, how fast they did the fundraising, how frequent they did fundraising, how their fundraising rounds, was it large or small compared to the others, and how to best fundraise, and trying to understand from the data how these companies differed from the rest. And they do differ a lot in many areas, and the data shows there's a lot of factors that does not matter at all. So leave yourself off the hook for a number of things, but you can try to match some other factors to become a successful founder. And I spent 4 years, all my weekends and evenings, to collect this 30,000 data point data set on these 65 factors per companies, and spent another 2 years analyzing the data and interviewing with people. So I interviewed people like Peter Thiel, Erik, founder of Zoom, Tony Fadell of iPod, iPhone, and Nest, Tom Preston-Werner of GitHub, Keith Raboy of Founders Fund, Alfred Lin of Sequoia, Rachel Carson of Guild Education, Michelle Zatlin of Cloudflare, Neha of Confluent, 15 founders of billion-dollar startups. And, I try to ask them deep questions about the early days of their companies. So basically, these interviews kind of color in or add context to a lot of these data. So each chapter comes with an interview, and that interview is either an outlier to the data or is a representative of the data, and is trying to paint more color.
And what did you find? Let's unpack some of the biggest takeaways.
For sure. So there are two aspects to the things that the book and the study finds. There are things that say these things don't matter, and it's mostly around these kind of things that have been stereotyped. Most of them come from media, from the famous startup stories, that makes us think that massive successful startups come and look like in a certain shape. So I think there's because of the Wozniak and the Bill Gates and the Apple stories and the Microsoft stories, I think a lot of people have this thought that most successful startups have exactly two founders. And that's what we also see in a lot of cases. And when I looked into data, it seems like the distribution of the number of co-founders that you have among the billion-dollar startups and among kind of normal startups that get founded and funded doesn't, it's the same distribution. So if you have a solo founder, 1 out of every 5 unicorn has a solo founder, and they're as likely as the others to become a unicorn. And then there's like 35%, which is 2 co-founders, and then 30% that is three co-founders, and on and on. But in none of these cases, it increases or decreases your chances of success. And that's why sometimes I say, give a co-founder title to your kind of first employee. That if you can't attract them without giving them a co-founder title, just give it, and just attract an amazing employee. There's another myth that a lot of these billion-dollar companies or successful companies, they're solving their own personal problems. And that is true for a number of them, but that doesn't apply to all of them, or it doesn't apply to the majority of them. So a big percentage of billion-dollar startups, it was a result of a deliberate ideation process. These people went through 1 year, 2 years of kind of searching for the right idea. And we only hear the good part of it when they interview, and they kind of link it to how this kind of linked to their previous thing that they did, or how it linked to the thing that they were doing when they were a kid. But actually, when you go deeper, you understand these people spent 2 years just jumping from one idea to another, in one industry to another, to find the idea that worked. And in most cases, it was not a personal problem. Then the other thing is like industry experience. And a lot of people are looking for the right people with industry experience, and it turns out it doesn't matter. It does not increase or decrease your chance of success if you have or do not have industry experience. And 70% of founders of kind of tech companies did not have industry experience. It's a different story in biotech and hard sciences. Kind of 80% of people in those industries had industry experience. What else? There's things about age. There's this famous Harvard Business Review article that says, the most successful entrepreneurs are 45. And they're more likely to found businesses. And then you look at VCs, and a lot of VCs are looking into universities, looking into people 2 years with 2 years of experience out of Google or Facebook, and these tend to be people in their early 20s. And when I compare the data from these billion-dollar unicorn startups with the startups that had received a little bit of funding and didn't get anywhere, to kind of the average startup, again, there's no difference in the distribution. So age doesn't correlate at all with success. Being younger or older doesn't. Then we have dropouts. A lot of people talk about dropouts and think, college dropouts, that's the majority, or that's the big part of, startups. Only 4% of billion-dollar startups are started by dropouts. There are more PhDs. There are more people with law degrees. There are more professors than college dropouts. Among billion-dollar startup founders, and it doesn't make them lesser likely or more likely to start billion-dollar companies, but just putting it in the context. We are the same thing in like schools. Schools are good. Going through having that Stanford brand is good, and I know you're working on deck. But there were as many founding CEOs of billion-dollar startups that attended the schools which ranked 100 or kind of lower, the higher, 100 or worse, that started billion-dollar companies, as there were people who went to top 10 schools. So it looks like a barbell distribution. There are these people who have, the perfect pedigree and the perfect resume. And there are also people who do not have that, and they have kind of built their way into becoming a billion-dollar founder by starting companies and starting projects and kind of getting there. There are things about, you have to start a new category, or you need to, start a company in a wide space. There are a lot of investors, reject companies. This is a crowded space. Turns out 70% of billion-dollar startups had strong competition when they started out, and they were not starting a new category. A lot of people say, if you start a new category, you're more likely to create larger outcomes. The $100 billion companies are in new categories. That's also wrong. Actually, the data showed the companies that were competing for share in an existing large market, they created on average larger companies than those that created a new category. There's a lot. It's 300 pages of book. There's like 50 charts and facts like this in the book. Around what type of needs these billion-dollar companies were starting. If you're going after saving people's time or money, you were more likely to create a billion-dollar company than if you were going after convenience, entertainment, or even health. And, we talked about market share. And if you were taking market share from others, a majority of these billion-dollar startups were that way.
That's an awesome overview. What I'd like you to do is go through some of those points and ask you why you think those misconceptions exist.
Sure, let's do that.
So whether it's age, or whether it's the co-founder or single founder, whether it's the schools, why don't you pick a few and say why you think, like, basically, there's probably going to be some resistance to some of your conclusions, even though it's given. And I'm curious, which ones do you think will be more readily accepted versus not, and why that is?
Right. I think you're seeing some of these things change a little bit. Like the solo founder thing, I think it used to be a problem maybe 6-7 years ago. I see it less and less happening now. I think there are more people who are receptive to the idea of solo founder now. And I think a big part of this is coming from the famous anecdotes. And that's basically what data is trying to dispel. Because it's not like we have only 5 successful companies. We have over 200 billion-dollar companies founded in the past 15 years. And, there's the Facebooks and the Ubers of the world that make it to the media, and there are books written about them. And, every startup founder gets to read about them. But there's not a book or story or article or interview about every one of them, or that people remember. So I think a big part of these misconceptions come from the fact that some of these stories get more famous than the others, and they happen to be in a certain way. They happen to be the 2-founder situation. They happen to be the college dropout situation. And that's why, there's some of these, I think, biases exist in our industry and among people, and some of them are getting solved. So with the solo founder situation, I think it makes intuitive sense that, if you know something, and if you're technical, I think this is the most common thing that I hear. If you're a technical founder, you need someone business savvy, and the other way around. And when I actually looked into data, this is very weird. And very counterintuitive. If you were a technical CEO of a unicorn, it was more likely that your second person in the company, whether it was a CTO, COO, whatever, was a technical person as well. And if you were a non-technical CEO of a billion-dollar startup, it was more likely that your second person was also non-technical. And I think the reason that this happens is where these people work and where they find co-founders. If you are a CS degree student at Stanford, chances are your friends are also CS degrees at Stanford, and that's what you're doing. And if you have been a biz dev person in a bunch of companies, chances are your colleagues or people the best, and you're going to start companies, they are a salesperson from another company as well, or another colleague that works in biz dev, or you've started companies together. So it's very counterintuitive that this kind of notion of you need to pick one technical person and one business savvy person and pair them up together and be exactly 2 people and like this, that's just wrong. And the data kind of dispels this.
Yeah. What were some things that you tried to learn that might have been harder to find the data, or what didn't make the book that you were hoping might make it?
The hardest part of the data collection was about what the world looked like back in 2007 or back in 2009 when these companies were started. So because my study in my book is all about the fundamentals and day one rather than the momentum. So in my book, I don't discuss, if your year one sales or growth or months over months growth look like this. You looked more like these billion-dollar companies. I do not talk about them. It's fundamentally about, this was the team, this was the backgrounds, this is the idea, this is where the idea was generated. This was a competition. This is what the market looked like. And the hardest part was kind of going back in time and understanding what the market for this category looked like back in 2007 and how many competitors were around. So it took a lot of research, a lot of kind of reading old articles, cold emailing some of these founders and asking them to understand, what the world of this specific space looked like, 10 years ago. And if it was easier, I think I could have found more insights about the market dynamics and about the competition. There's some higher level insights that I found, and mostly around what was the problem you were solving, what kind of need you were solving, and a little bit on competition and the market dynamics. But if there was more data, we could have kind of gone deeper into those type of features and dynamics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Going through one by one on a few of them. Why do you think that you don't need to be technical anymore? And is it sort of a timing thing, and that's only more recent, or has it you often been that way, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not saying you do not need to be technical. I would still recommend people, to pick up things and try to, prototype things themselves. The way I have defined technical for this research is more rigorous. Like, I think there's a lot of people who can go and, learn how to code and do a small prototype themselves. I wouldn't consider that like technical. You wouldn't remain as the CTO of that company for the next 10 years. For that, you would actually need to have, and there's a lot of ways that you can actually properly learn and get the experience and, becoming a technical person. But, you could be in sales, you could be in business development, you could have just started companies before. And what I found is the thing that transfers from one company to another, from one experience to another, is these soft skills, is these connections, is your ability to manage a team, is your ability to go through from crisis to crisis, is your ability to fundraise, to tell a story, to pitch. This is what stays. And you can learn whatever technical thing is that you need to learn about, fintech, going from fintech to databases to, building rockets. You can learn that. And you can become technical in that space for the extent that you need to get things going. And then you can hire the right people to come in and continue doing that. So it seems to me from this research that these soft skills are a lot more important. And you can see that in the fact that, a lot of these founders did not have domain expertise in the industry that they were going after. And a lot of these founders, were not technical in a sense that, they have been a, engineering manager for 5 years, or they have been, leading a team of 10 people of coders or software engineers for the past, couple of years.
That makes a lot of sense. What about the husband and wife in particular? Did you segment it out that way? Because that's always something, or even, partner, or romantic partner. That's always a bias people have.
For sure. Yeah, I think that is also a bias. I generalize it as, family members or people who are, connected in that sense. And yeah, that's another bias. And when you look at these, billion-dollar companies, there's a good number of them that have husband and wife, fiancés, brothers, father and son. These family relationships exist, 3 brothers. Again, father and son, 2 brothers, husband and wife. These exist. And I think, as long as they can address some of the challenges that, some VCs bring up, and I think that's fair, around governance, around, who the employees can trust to bring up, their concern about a CEO or CFO to. There's some of these, governance concerns that as long as they are addressed, I don't see any problems in that. And the data shows, there's a good number of these billion-dollar companies that were started by people who were related.
Yeah, that's encouraging. And let's go on the Ivy League stuff, or college stuff. One is, the stat around as many attended top 10 schools as went to schools not even ranking in the top 100 among billion-dollar startup founders. Why do you think that is?
I think I definitely observed this barbell distribution when I looked at the data. There are people who had the perfect pedigree. They went to the top school, they worked at a great company, and they went on and they started this company and it worked out. And so it looks like the perfect shiny resume. And those were kind of one type, and they were one extreme. And then there's this other extreme of the people who you've never heard of their school. It's they studied something. You kind of know it's those people who didn't care about the school, what they studied. They were doing something else, and they started a company when they're young, and it was they weren't even necessarily technical. In some cases they were, and they were they coded a game or something. And so it seems like there are these two different branches of the people with the perfect resume and the people who went on and started companies, started projects, went one thing after another. And it took them 9 years or 10 years, whatever, and it was hard for them to raise money in the earlier ventures, and even in the one that became a $1 billion company, because they didn't have that shiny resume. But then eventually they made it. So it's about either doing it back to back, or having that bug for building and stuff, or on the other hand, you have these people with the perfect resume. And when you compare people in the $1 billion group to people in the average group, which is people who have raised $3 million on funding from VCs. That's my random group, the average baseline group. And then we have the unicorns. They actually tend to be from better schools. And I think, it seems like the school does matter eventually on average. Probably it gives them better chance of raising funding and better chance of, attracting the right people, and better chance of, having the necessary networks. And part of it is just reverse correlation as well. Who these people were, who their parents were, what kind of socioeconomic background they're coming from that made it to these top schools. So it's not a causal relationship here. But yes, these people who were $1 billion founders, they were more likely to have gone to better ranking schools on average. But it's important to look at the data that is, there's these people who went to top 10 schools, and there's the number of founders who just didn't go through that type of a background.
And that makes a lot of sense. And one thing that was also interesting was just what you found about MBAs, and you touched on it a bit, but let's go deeper. Why do you think people underestimate MBAs, or why do you think MBAs have is it, and also is it causation or is it correlation?
Right. I think a lot of these things are cyclical. So right now, I think there's this bias against MBAs. Why are you wasting a couple $100,000 in 2 years of your life on getting a degree? Right. It's that, and it's at different parts of the industry. Right. And even right now, if you go and ask people in traditional industries, they will tell you, no, if you need to have an MBA, if you want to progress in your career, you need to go get an MBA. Or if you want to found a company, you need to have an MBA. And then you may go back, 10 years or 20 years, and things may look the reverse. Back then, a lot of these stereotypes that I discussed, I looked back in time and I saw that reverse stereotype was true maybe 15 years ago about, for example, the age thing, right? It used to be that, people with more experience and older, it was easier for them to raise funding back in, the early 2000s or the 90s. And now it's kind of the reverse. If you're in your early 20s and, you've just kind of gone through a good school and, a good company, worked in a good company for a couple of years, that might be easier for you to raise funding than if somebody is 50, 60 years old. And these things are kind of cyclical. So the same thing on MBA kind of exists, that right now the sentiment is kind of, it might not be useful. And we have to see, what happens in the future. But when you look at these $1 billion company founders, I think the number is 21%. 21% of these founders had an MBA, obviously on top of their bachelor's. And that's the most common advanced degree after, so it was first MBAs and then masters. And then I have to take a look at the book, but it's, I think, people with law degrees and then medical degrees and then professors, and then PhDs and professors. And it doesn't increase your chance, or it doesn't decrease your chance. So when you look at the random group, it's the same distribution as well, more or less. I think it's 20% in the random group and 21% in the $1 billion companies, not a statistically significant difference. Which means, one, investors aren't actually having a bias. Like a lot of people say this, but they actually have invested in people. Like nobody has gone to say, okay, because you had an Harvard MBA, I'm not going to invest in you. That bias kind of maybe exists on Twitter, but doesn't actually exist in reality. And that bias isn't true as well. They performed the same level as other founders. They were slightly more likely, but again, not statistically significant. And there's a lot of these massive companies, anywhere from Stitch Fix to Cloudflare, that were people in business school that they thought about these ideas, or even went through the competitions at business school, the pitch perfect competitions at school that came out of this. And the sentiment may change at one point. We may go back to this and say, hey, MBAs are good. We shouldn't invest in non-MBAs. And I think the point of the book is forget these proxy rules. People may have different career paths, and this thing, having or not having a specific degree, or having or not having studied a specific degree, that doesn't matter. And I think I had tweeted about this, and somebody asked me a question. I think another assumption that, okay, if you were an MBA and founder of $1 billion company, then you probably had a technical background before that. And I think that's a common, again, comes from that misconception. I looked at the data, and 88% of founding CEOs of $1 billion companies who had an MBA did not have a technical background. They came from a business background. They did work as someone in the business field. They got an MBA and they founded a $1 billion company.
That's really interesting. And maybe talk about just age again, more generally. Like, why do you think people don't sort of have the same instinct for what the right age is to start a company, or I would say the optimal age relative to the data?
Right. And to be, the data isn't saying that there is a perfect age, right? The data is saying there's no perfect age. You're as or more, you're not more or less likely, right, if you're finding a company. And the median age was 34 years old, which is, I think, a little bit older than what people may think. Some people may think now, and might be a little bit younger than people in the other parts of the industry may think. So there's this kind of famous Harvard Business Review article that this research and talked about this. And when I looked into this paper, the assumptions they have for defining what is a startup and what is a successful startup doesn't quite match the definitions that we have kind of in the startup ecosystem. And that's why, it might be the case that in more traditional industries or in other kind of sectors, being older, being more senior might matter. But, in this, and a lot of people say when you're younger, you have, you can take more risks, or you're more free to, or you come up with your best ideas in your early 20s. And the data is saying, these things are wrong, and people may come up with their best ideas at whatever age. And it's actually not about the ideas. It's about, you get to a certain point that you get the resources to execute on them. And what is important is how many companies you've started before, or what you have done in terms of starting projects before. So you might be a 20-year-old that have started 2 projects before this. And this would specifically be like the founders of Brex, which, they had started two projects, kind of companies, mini successes before, even though they were 19. And you might be, 50 years old, and you may have worked a perfect career, and you've never started a company before. And that might be a differentiating factor, right? It's not about age specifically. Your success doesn't correlate with your age, but it does correlate with, how much of a bug for building you had, how many side projects you did, how many side hustles you created, maybe companies you created, startups you founded. That does actually correlate with the success.
That's really interesting. And so why, or given all this data, how do you use it as an investor? How I know you've been interested in algorithmic investing as well, or the opportunity to be more data-driven investor. Talk a little bit about that.
For sure. So I think data in general can be used for being a better investor in 2 ways. Number one, by reducing bias. So we may unknowingly have certain biases towards certain people with, the way our brain does, pattern matching. And there are cases when, if you can only pick one investment, if you have 2 opportunities, but you can pick only one, you may unknowingly go and pick the one that your brain likes. But if you put it on paper and you actually compare these opportunities, and you look at the data, and you abstract things like gender and race and any of these things that are irrelevant, or age or these kind of things. If you abstract these and look at the business, look at the idea, look at the background of the founders, their career path, then you may actually end up making a better decision, which has less bias that's known or unknown to you. And you have this bias in the way that VCs source. I see a lot of VCs that source basically by going university programs. That you're creating that bias right away. You're creating that age bias right away, or investors that take the technical versus non-technical bias, or MBA versus all of these biases that people have changes the way they source and look for companies, and that creates a bias. So I think number one, by removing bias and better modeling these companies and how many risk layers they have. I like to look at the companies by the risk layers they have, or basically the number of miracles that need to happen. And you put that on paper and see, okay, this company, both of them at seed, both of them same valuation, but this one needs 5 miracles, this other one needs 3 miracles, or 3 ways to go against the data. Then you may probably pick the one with 3. That's one. Number 2 is you may actually use this data to better source or algorithmically kind of find opportunities based on what this data tells you. And it's 30,000 data points. You cannot really apply very good deep learning here. It's it's enough, but not really enough. But you can start by doing machine learning on this data, or simpler statistical ways to better understand these founders and source opportunities, or make investment decisions. So for example, I invested in this company called Carbon Health, which is a unicorn now, employs 1,500 people. I'm on the board, and the decision to invest in this company was absolutely backed by the data. This is 2018. I had just collected this data, and I saw this founder, and it just it perfectly matched the pattern that was kind of created in my mind about what a successful entrepreneur looked like. And this, the founder, Aaron Bali, not gone through the good school. I think he had studied in Turkey, hadn't worked in any of these big companies before. But Carbon Health was I think it was his 5th company. I think he had failed 3 companies before, but also founded Udemy. So I saw a lot of these patterns to what my data was telling me. And that kind of gave me this power to go and fight for this deal. And it was a hard deal to get done because it kind of looked out of scope. But I fought for this deal and got it done, and it's a massive success now. And I think that's something that can be repeated. I'm using that data in the way I source companies or make decisions on investing in companies.
I thought it was interesting. There's this trope that people have to, be competing in a place with no competition. The Peter Thiel don't compete. But you say that competition is actually good. Talk a bit about that.
Absolutely. So it turns out, I think 55% of billion-dollar companies were competing with incumbents. I think another 20-something% were competing in a fragmented market. And less than 30% of companies did not have competition, even less than that. So there was 5 or 6% that were competing with other highly funded startups. And that seems like the worst situation when you were comparing the data from unicorns to kind of the average group. So if you're a startup and you're copying what another company that has raised $20 million is doing, you're less likely to succeed. But if you go after the Googles of the world, go after Airbnbs of the world, go after Cisco's, or go like Flexport in a fragmented old market with a bunch of small kind of player, none of them have more than 10% of market share, and you go and disrupt those markets. In both of these cases, it's perfect. The market is educated. The market is massive. There are multiple billion-dollar companies in the market. And basically, by taking their efficiencies away, you are creating a billion-dollar company yourself. So competition is not a bad thing. Copying another highly funded startup is probably a bad thing. But generally, just competing in a market and going after something that Facebook cannot do well, or Google cannot do well, or Airbnb cannot do well, that's a perfect situation. And even better if you're going after things that even older or more incumbent companies cannot do.
That makes sense. And then also you also unpack the myth that founders don't have to be the personally living through the problem that they're facing, or be their own customer, or have been thinking about their idea for many years, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there is this myth, and that you need to be solving a personal problem something that you've lived through, something that you are the customer for. And that might be an ideal case, and that does make intuitive sense. But that's probably also why we have so many companies going after, grocery delivery or, a bunch of things that are, consumer personal problems. And there's not enough people going after things that are not one specific person's problem, either from climate change to, agriculture or the food economy or the kind of global level. There's a lot of global challenges, trillion-dollar problems that a lot of people don't go after because it's nobody's personal problem. And when you look at the stories of these billion-dollar companies, in a lot of cases, when you look at the interview or the movie that gets made, there's all these threads that people are trying to draw, that how their childhood affected this problem that they're going to solve, or how what they were doing before kind of turned into this thing that they ended up doing. But in reality, a lot of these people went through this deliberate and lengthy ideation process. They changed the idea. They went to the market. They tried something. They asked people. They saw it doesn't work. They changed it. They went to another market. They moved horizontally. They moved vertically. And you don't see that because that doesn't make it public. They don't tell the story. They spend 1 or 2 years. They come up with the idea. It works. And then when they're doing an interview or when the media kind of build something, they just try to create this direct thread from one problem they faced when they were a child, and why they're solving this specific problem. And in a lot of cases, these are opportunistic. A lot of investors do not like founders who are opportunistic, who see an opportunity and just say, okay, I'm going to go and make some money there. And that's wrong. A lot of these billion-dollar companies were opportunistic, and people saw an opportunity that they had the right network or they had the right, skills to go after, and they went after it and they made a billion-dollar company.
That's a great place to wrap. Ali, in closing, for people who liked what they heard, where can people buy the book and learn more?
You can order anywhere you can buy books: Amazon, Audible, Kindle, audiobook stores, ebook stores, Target, Walmart, and local bookstores. You can support your local bookstore as well if they have it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ali. This has been great.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.